You did everything right. You went to college, maybe even grad school. You worked hard, stayed curious, tried to be a decent person. And somewhere in your early 30s, maybe late 20s, you looked around and felt this quiet nagging sense that something was supposed to have clicked by now. Not dramatic despair, just a low hum. A persistent feeling that you are somehow behind, somehow missing the point, somehow living a life that looks fine from the outside, but feels slightly off from the inside. And by the end of this, you will understand why that feeling is not a personal failure, but a structural one, and why understanding the difference might be the most honest thing you do for yourself this year. Let's start with the paradox. Millennials, roughly those born between 1981 and 1996, are statistically the most educated generation in American history. They are more globally connected, more politically aware, more psychologically literate than any generation before them. And yet study after study shows that millennials report higher rates of anxiety, loneliness, and burnout than their parents did at the same age. They earn less in inflation-adjusted dollars, they own homes at lower rates, and they carry more student loan debt than any previous generation. The American Psychological Association has repeatedly flagged millennials and now Gen Z as the most stressed adult demographics in the country. So here is the core tension: a generation that was given more tools, more information, more opportunity, and told explicitly and repeatedly that they could be anything, is somehow more lost, more exhausted, more uncertain than the generations that had fewer options and less encouragement. How do you square that? How do you explain a generation that is objectively more equipped and subjectively more struggling? The philosopher Charles Taylor, in his book The Malaise of Modernity, wrote something that cuts right to the heart of this. He said that modern life has created what he called a flattening of existence, where the frameworks that once gave human life its sense of weight and meaning have quietly dissolved, but nothing has been put in their place. People are left with radical freedom and no map. That phrase has stayed with me: radical freedom and no map. Because that is exactly what it feels like to be a millennial in America in 2026. You have been handed an enormous amount of choice: where to live, who to be, what to believe, what career to build, whether to have children, what identity to claim. And choice, we were told, is liberation. Choice is good. More choice, more freedom, more freedom, more happiness. But that is where the conventional wisdom breaks down, because it turns out that more choice does not automatically produce more happiness. It frequently produces the opposite. The psychologist Barry Schwartz wrote an entire book about this called The Paradox of Choice. His research showed that when people are given too many options, they do not feel freer. They feel paralyzed. And even when they do make a decision, they feel less satisfied with it because they are haunted by all the roads not taken. He called this the tyranny of choice. And this is not a small quirk of human psychology. It is a consistent, replicable finding. Schwartz ran studies in which people choosing from a limited selection of options reported higher satisfaction than people choosing from a larger one. The JAM experiment, conducted by psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper, put this on the map. When a grocery store displayed 24 flavors of jam, 6 times more people stopped to look. But when the display was reduced to 6 flavors, people were 10 times more likely to actually buy. Abundance froze people. Scarcity, paradoxically, freed them. Now scale that up. You are not choosing between 24 flavors of jam. You are choosing between versions of your entire life. And every time you commit to one path, you grieve the others. Every time you choose a city, a partner, a job, a self, you are also saying goodbye to the infinite other selves you could have been. That is a kind of low-grade existential grief that no generation before yours had to carry in quite the same way, not because they were wiser, but because they simply had fewer options. But the paradox of choice is only one layer. There is something deeper happening. The sociologist Emile Durkheim, writing in the late 1800s, introduced the concept of anomie. It means, roughly, a state of normlessness, a condition in which the shared rules, rituals, and expectations that hold a society together have broken down, and the individual is left floating. Durkheim wrote about this in the context of industrialization, but the concept maps almost perfectly onto millennial experience today. The institutions that used to provide structure, the church, the stable career ladder, the geographic rootedness, the nuclear family as a default life script, have either collapsed, fragmented, or been revealed as optional, which is, in many ways, good progress. But the psychological cost is real. When everyone can design their own life, no one can take their life design for granted. You cannot just inherit meaning, you have to construct it from scratch. Every generation, you. And constructing meaning is hard work, genuinely hard. It requires a kind of sustained inner labor that most of us were never really taught how to do. We were taught how to optimize. We were taught how to perform. We were taught how to succeed by metrics that someone else designed, but we were not taught how to ask what we actually want, how to sit with uncertainty, how to commit to something in the absence of guarantees. The psychologist Jean Twenge, who has tracked generational shifts in mental health data over decades, found something particularly striking. Millennials who were raised with what she calls an ethic of self-esteem, meaning constant affirmation, the idea that you are special, that you can be anything, actually showed higher rates of narcissistic traits and lower resilience than earlier generations, not because they were bad people, but because the message they received created a gap between expectation and reality that was almost impossible to close. When you are told the world is your oyster for 20 years, and then you graduate into a financial crisis, a housing market that treats you like a stranger, and a job market that wants 5 years of experience for an entry-level position, the dissonance is not just frustrating, it is destabilizing. There is a metaphor I keep coming back to. Imagine you are given a GPS and told to drive to your destination, except the GPS was programmed in 1995. The roads have completely changed, and half the destinations on the map no longer exist. You are driving with total confidence in a tool that is quietly leading you nowhere. That is what it feels like to follow the script that was handed to millennials. Get good grades. Go to college, get a good job, buy a house. The script was real once. The roads existed, but the map has not been updated, and many of the destinations have moved or disappeared entirely. So what do you do with that? This is where the reframe begins. The philosopher Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote about it in Man's Search for Meaning, made a distinction that I think is one of the most useful ideas in all of psychology. He drew a line between what he called the pleasure principle, the drive to maximize pleasure and avoid pain, and the meaning principle, the deeper human drive to find a sense of purpose, even in suffering. Frankl watched people in the most extreme conditions imaginable, and what he found was that the people who survived, psychologically and sometimes physically, were not the ones who were strongest or most resourceful. Well, they were the ones who had a reason to survive. A why? A meaning. Frankl wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Now here is the reframe. The millennial generation has been, largely, a generation oriented around the pleasure principle in its modern form. Optimize, maximize, upgrade. Upgrade your career, your apartment, your body, your relationship, your feed, yourself. The assumption buried underneath all of this is that if you just get the conditions right, you will feel good. You will feel happy. You will feel like your life makes sense. But Frankl's insight, and the insight of every major philosophical tradition, from Aristotle to the Stoics to the Buddhists, is that this is exactly backwards. Meaning does not come from getting the conditions right. It comes from commitment, from engagement, from choosing something and bringing your full self to it, even when it is imperfect, even when it is hard. Aristotle called this eudaimonia. and it is often translated as happiness. But that translation loses almost everything. Eudaimonia is closer to flourishing. It is not a feeling you have. It is an activity you do. It is what happens when you are living in accordance with your deepest capacities, when you are engaged fully with something that stretches you and matters to you. The Greeks did not believe you found a eudaimonia by scrolling through options. They believed you found it by showing up, again and again, to something you had chosen and were willing to grow inside of. The Stoics pushed this even further. Marcus Aurelius, who was arguably the most powerful person in the world during his lifetime as Roman emperor, wrote in his private journals, now known as Meditations, that the obstacle is the way. He was not being glib. He was making a precise philosophical point, that resistance, difficulty, and constraint are not the enemies of a meaningful life. They are often the conditions that make meaning possible. Because meaning is not discovered in frictionless abundance. It is forged in engaged effort. And then there is Erich Fromm, the mid-20th century psychologist and philosopher, who argued in Escape from Freedom that human beings have a paradoxical relationship with freedom. We want it desperately. We fight for it. But when we actually get it, a deep part of us panics, because freedom means responsibility. Freedom means you cannot blame the system, the family, the circumstances. Freedom means it is on you. And that is terrifying. Fromm said that many people, when faced with this terror, engage in what he called escape mechanisms. They conform. They merge with a crowd. They abdicate their individuality to an authority, a trend, an ideology, a brand, anything to relieve the pressure of having to be the author of their own life. Does any of that sound familiar? I am not asking rhetorically. I have been there too. The millennial experience of endlessly refreshing social media, of identity shopping through aesthetics and subcultures, of building a personal brand as a substitute for a personal self. These are not character flaws. They are Fromm's escape mechanisms playing out in a digital landscape. They are what happens when people are handed radical freedom and no map, and the silence of that freedom is too loud to sit with. So what do you actually do with all of this? Because this is the place where most videos and books leave you hanging. They diagnose the problem beautifully and then offer you a 5-step plan that somehow misses the emotional truth of how hard this actually is. I want to try to do something different. The first thing I would invite you to do is to notice the difference between a life you are building and a life you are performing. This is not a binary. It is a spectrum. But there is a real distinction between choices you make because they feel genuinely yours, and choices you make because they photograph well, because they signal the right things to the right people, because they are legible as success to the world you grew up in. Spend a week noticing, not judging, just noticing. When you make a decision, whose voice is in your head? Is it yours? Or is it the voice of an imagined audience? That question alone, held consistently, can begin to shift something. The second invitation is what I would call the practice of voluntary constraint. This one is counterintuitive, and I want to explain it carefully. The idea is this: instead of keeping every option open because it feels like freedom, try deliberately narrowing your field. Commit to one creative project for 90 days without evaluating it against alternatives. Commit to one city, one relationship, one direction, long enough to actually go deep rather than wide. The research on this, and there is a lot of it, consistently shows that people report higher satisfaction and more creative output when they work within constraints rather than in open-ended freedom. The poet Elizabeth Bishop wrote all her best work under severe formal constraints. The filmmaker Christopher Nolan limits himself to practical effects wherever possible. Constraint is not the enemy of creativity or meaning. It is often the engine of both. And the third invitation, and this one is the hardest, is to practice what the philosopher Simone Weil called attention. Not productivity, not optimization. Attention. Weil wrote, that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. What she meant was this: to really attend to something, to be fully present with a person, a problem, a piece of work, without immediately trying to fix it, improve it, or move on to the next thing, is an act of profound care. It is also, she argued, the closest most of us get to genuine contact with reality. The millennial tendency, understandably shaped by the attention economy, is to skim, to scan, to keep one eye on the exit. The practice of full attention, even for 20 minutes a day, on one thing that matters to you, is quietly radical in a world designed to prevent it. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. Knowing all of this, reading Frankl and Aristotle and Fromm, understanding the paradox of choice and the concept of anomie, none of that automatically makes it easier. There is a real gap between intellectual understanding and lived experience. You can know in the abstract that meaning comes from commitment rather than optimization, and still spend 3 hours on a Sunday night refreshing job listings you are not going to apply for. You can understand Fromm's escape mechanisms and still feel yourself reaching for your phone the moment a conversation gets uncomfortable. Knowing is not the same as being. And I think one of the cruelest tricks of our information-saturated moment is that it makes us feel like understanding something is the same as having integrated it. It is not. The work is longer, slower, and more interior than any article or video can fully capture. What I can offer is a frame, a direction, a way of thinking about the disorientation you feel that does not pathologize you or shame you into self-improvement. The disorientation is real. It has structural causes, and the people who seem fine are mostly just better at hiding the same disorientation, or they have found a way to stop asking the questions, which is not the same as having answered them. There is a line from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke from his Letters to a Young Poet that I come back to constantly. He wrote, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is, to live everything, live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." That is the note I want to leave you on, not with a tidy resolution, not with a 5-step plan. But with this, the confusion you feel is not a malfunction. It is a question your life is asking you. And the most honest thing you can do with it is not to silence it, not to fix it, not to perform your way past it, but to live it, carefully, patiently, with as much honesty as you can manage on any given day. The feeling that being a millennial is somehow different is not nostalgia, and it is not weakness. It is the accurate perception of a genuine rupture between the world you were prepared for and the world you actually arrived in. You were handed a map for a territory that no longer exists. And the task, the real task, is not to find a better map. It is to learn how to navigate without one. If this is the kind of conversation you want more of, subscribing means you will not miss the next one. This channel exists to take ideas seriously and bring them to life in a way that is actually usable. And I am genuinely curious. What is one thing about your life right now that feels like you inherited it rather than chose it? Leave it in the comments. I read them.